So I've got a presentation for you all today, and we're going to do a deep dive into the idiom of resurrection and how that appears to have evolved from the earliest days on down the centuries to where we finally got the resurrection of Christ. So this is some fascinating material I came across years ago in reading Professor Lloyd Gearing, who has an online book you should really check out called Resurrection, a Symbol of Hope. And I kept on seeing this idea appear again and again in the works of John Levinson, John Day, various Old Testament scholars. And I was like, I've got to do something with this. We need to take a deep dive into this. So that's what this presentation is all about. So we can begin whenever you're ready, Derek.
All right, go ahead and share it. You share your screen, I mean.
All right. So the title of this presentation is From Baal and Osiris to Christ, the Evolution of the Idiom of Resurrection. In past presentations, past articles and videos and whatnot, I have discussed resurrection in paganism, excuse me, pertaining to various dying and rising gods and so forth. So, for instance, we know Baal is swallowed up by Mot and buried, but then ascends to the throne alive and victorious, having defeated Mot. Osiris is dismembered by Set, but reassembled and bodily raised, taking up his throne in the netherworld. Inanna is killed by Ereshkigal and hung on a hook, but revived with the water and food of life, and then she ascends to the land of the living. Dionysus is eviscerated by the Titans, but reassembled and restored to life by either Rhea or Demeter. And then Adonis lives again after being mauled to death by a boar. So for all the sources on this, you can check out my previous presentation, Resurrection and Apotheosis in Pre-Christian Antiquity. But what we're discussing there is how these are ideas, motifs, legends, really, that are analogous to the death and resurrection of Christ. There's no suggestion that any of this has been borrowed by early Christians. We're just making the point that, excuse me, these are similar type legends that we find in the ancient world.
That's well put.
So resurrection in Judaism, we have to discuss, obviously, the contribution of Judaism to Christianity, because that is, Christianity, of course, began as a sect within Judaism. So resurrection first appears in the Hebrew Bible as a metaphor for the restoration of Israel after turbulent times. Examples include Hosea 6, Isaiah 26:19, and Ezekiel 37. The first mention of a literal resurrection of the dead in the Hebrew Bible occurs in Daniel. It says, multitudes who sleep in the dust of the earth will awake, some to everlasting life, others to shame and everlasting contempt. Daniel 12:2. Prior to that, it's only ever been a metaphor for the restoration of Israel. Now it's been literalized in Daniel. Apocryphal works like First Enoch, Second Maccabees, and the Sibylline Oracles include Jewish references to the resurrection as well. So resurrection is a staple of Second Temple Judaism by the time Christianity emerges in the first century CE. The point being, there's no need to, if we're looking at Christianity's emergence in the first century, there's really no need to go running to pagan cults in order to explain the origin of resurrection belief in Christianity, because it was already homegrown in Judaism. It was already a staple of Second Temple Judaism. That's the point. The question is, what is the origin of Jewish resurrection belief? Where did the Jews themselves originate and develop this idea? And that's where things get really interesting, and that's what we're going to primarily discuss today. So, when Israel was a child, archaeologists and historians have long known that Israelite culture was born out of Canaanite culture. Genetic evidence even suggests that modern day Jews and Arabs are descended from Canaanites. See, Jews and Arabs descended from Canaanites by the Biblical Archaeological Society, June 2020 publication. So we've known from archaeology and history that the Israelites were an indigenous tribe of Canaanites. Now we even have genetic evidence backing this idea up. In the Hebrew Bible, El, the supreme God of Canaan, persisted in his identity of the Most High, that or El Elyon. He goes by many names. We see vestiges of this in Psalm 82, where El presides over the divine council. Deuteronomy 32, 8 through 9 suggests that El was the father of Yahweh, and that he actually allotted Israel to Yahweh, his son. And then, of course, El's mighty son Baal, the cloud rider and conqueror of the sea monsters, still shaped depictions of Yahweh riding on the wings of the wind and subduing Leviathan. So we have ideas that had always been associated with Baal. We even find them attached to Yahweh in the Hebrew Bible. So there are all these allusions and telltale clues to the persistence of Canaanite culture, myth, and legend in the Hebrew Bible itself. So we'll discuss Hosea, the first prophet of resurrection. When the Hebrew prophets spoke metaphorically of Israel's death and rebirth, they framed it in terms of an old Canaanite myth, the death and resurrection of Baal. The first Old Testament author to apply this metaphor was the prophet Hosea in the 8th century BC. As Hosea says, "Come, let us return to the Lord. He has torn us to pieces, but he will heal us. He has injured us, but he will bind up our wounds. After 2 days, he will revive us. On the third day, he will restore us, that we may live in his presence. Let us acknowledge the Lord. Let us press on to acknowledge him. As surely as the sun rises, he will appear. He will come to us like the winter rains, like the spring rains that water the earth." That's Hosea 6, 1 through 3. Compare this also to 1 Corinthians 15, 4, where Paul is saying that the resurrection of Jesus occurred according to the scriptures, that he's getting some of this from Hosea itself. Again, here in Hosea, this is a metaphor for Israel. It's not saying anyone's literally going to be resurrected. It's about the metaphorical death and rebirth of the nation of Israel, but appears to be applying a more ancient motif. He will come to us like the spring rains. Previously in chapter 5, Hosea spoke of God tearing Judah to pieces like a ravenous lion. In Canaanite myth, Mot, the god of death who devoured Baal in the underworld, is likewise compared to a lion. We see this in multiple scholarly sources point this out. Baal's death is bewailed by his consort, Anath, and the supreme god El, though El later beholds in a dream that the heavens rain oil and the valleys run with honey. Thus he knows that Baal, the god of rain and fertility, is alive. In the same way, Hosea declares that God will come to us like the winter rains, like the spring rains that water the earth. Only it is Israel who has been symbolically torn asunder and restored to life and vitality, not Yahweh. So what the Israelites appear to have done is they didn't depict Yahweh in this way. Instead, they applied this motif metaphorically to themselves, to the nation of Israel. Where, O death, is your destruction? Hosea 13 repeats the motif of the lion who devours Israel, though they will be delivered from the realm of the dead, just as Baal had been. As it says, I will deliver this people from the power of the grave. I will redeem them from death. Where, O death, are your plagues? Where, O grave, is your destruction? That's Hosea 13:14. Compare Paul's use of this in 1 Corinthians 15:55. The language of flourishing nature and springtime, of life and vitality, is used again to describe their redemption. Says, I will be like the dew to Israel. He will blossom like a lily, like a cedar of Lebanon. He will send down his roots. His young roots will grow. His young shoots will grow. His splendor will be like an olive tree. His fragrance like a cedar of Lebanon. People will dwell again in his shade. They will flourish like the grain. They will blossom like the vine. Israel's fame will be like the wine of Lebanon. So we see the use of all these agricultural type imagery in the descriptions of Israel's death and restoration as a nation. The earth will give birth to her dead. Old Testament scholar John Day notes the imagery of death and resurrection in Hosea is directly taken over by the prophet from the imagery of the dying and rising fertility god Baal. Hosea, of course, was highly polemical against the cult of Baal, but polemic can sometimes involve taking up one's enemy's imagery and reutilizing it for one's own purposes. That's per Yahweh and the gods and goddesses of Canaan. Inspired by his predecessor, Hosea, Isaiah in the 7th century BC continues this tradition using the idiom of resurrection from death to describe Israel's restoration. But your dead will live, Lord, their bodies will rise. Let those who dwell in the dust wake up and shout for joy. Your dew is like the dew of the morning. The earth will give birth to her dead. You have to remember, in Israel and in ancient Canaan, it was the sterility of the hot, dry summers that brought about the death of vegetation and crop life. So when the spring rains came, even the winter rains, it brought about renewed life and vitality. And so we see these metaphors being used from the earliest days of Canaan all the way through the ancient Hebrew prophets. He will spew out what he has swallowed. Jeremiah in the 6th century BC speaks of Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, devouring and swallowing Israel whole. But Babylon is captured and seized, his land made dry and desolate, and thereupon forced to spew out what he has swallowed. Direct reference is made here to Baal's Babylonian counterpart, Baal, who was now cast in the role of the loathsome enemy. The symbolism is reminiscent of Mot's devouring of Baal, followed by Anath seizing Mot and demanding Baal's release. It sounds very much like that ancient imagery from the Baal cycle. Similarly, Jonah spent 3 days and 3 nights in the belly of the great fish, deep in the realm of the dead, but God brought him up alive from the pit. Jonah, like the suffering servant of Israel, Jonah, like the suffering servant of Isaiah, represents Israel during the exile to Babylon. Important point to note there, was never meant the story in Jonah to be taken literally. Even in Jonah, this is about death and restoration, and it's a metaphor for the nation of Israel. And then finally, we get to resurrection in Daniel. By the 2nd century BC, in the face of ongoing struggles against foreign occupation, Daniel provides us with a literal interpretation of resurrection from the dead. Daniel seizes upon the idiom of resurrection, hitherto only a metaphor, and re-mythologizes it in the form of final justice and a promise of everlasting life for the righteous. But behind the scriptural antecedents of resurrection that lead up to Daniel lies the momentous Israelite transformation of the myth of the Canaanite god Baal. As John D. Levinston says, in the Canaanite version, Baal dies a victim of deified death, that is Mot, in the hot, dry summer. Nature dies with him. But death is in turn killed, Baal lives anew, and nature flourishes and luxuriates in response. Israelite culture, at least as reflected in the Hebrew Bible, adapts this model to a theology centered on the Lord's relation to the people Israel in history. So this is just kind of a brief overview of these ideas. I highly suggest checking out the works of Lloyd Gearing, John Levinson here, as well as John Day. But we're going to move on to another aspect of this. This is when Egypt ruled Canaan. The New Kingdom period of Egypt saw its empire stretch well into northern Palestine from about the 16th to 11th centuries BC. So Egypt used to rule the place. Archaeological excavations have unearthed numerous Egyptian artifacts throughout the Levant, including funerary stelae from a cemetery at Deir el-Balah in Gaza, depicting the deceased worshiping Osiris, god of the afterlife. In the image in this slide, these images of Osiris here being worshipped, these are actually they've been excavated from Palestine, not Egypt. They're excavated from Palestine, so we know he was present there. A stela from the 18th dynasty depicts Osiris's reign over Egypt and the institution of Pharaoh as his earthly representative, in striking analogy to Psalm 78's portrayal of God's reign over Israel, with David installed as his earthly regent. Even the NIV Archaeological Study Bible by Zondervan admits that there is some influence here. The sibling rivalry between Osiris and his brother Set, who betrayed and murdered him, is reflected in the story of Cain and Abel. There are different agricultural allusions in that story that do allude to the story of Osiris and Set. And the Song of Songs strongly parallels ancient Egyptian love poetry. Again, the NIV Archaeological Bible Study Bible admits that there's most certainly influence here. So we know that Egypt had a presence in Canaan, not just during the time they ruled from the 16th to 11th centuries BC, but for centuries onward. And Israel continued to be a major trade route between ancient Egypt and various cultures, civilizations to the north and northeast, such as Assyria and Mesopotamia. Restored on the third day, Osiris was shred to pieces by his jealous brother Set, but reassembled and restored to life by Isis. By ancient Egyptian reckoning, his resurrection occurred on the third day after his death. From the ancient Egyptian pyramid texts, "O my father Osiris the king, awake, stand up at yonder eastern side of the sky at this place where the gods are born. When there comes this time of tomorrow and this time of the third day, my father the king will be born on yonder eastern side of the sky where the gods are born. When there comes this time of tomorrow and this time of the third day. O king, there comes this time of tomorrow and this time of 3 days. A stairway to the sky is set up for you among the imperishable stars." And then we'll look at the Icronephrite stela as well as Plutarch. Egyptologist Bohana Mosjav tells us concerning the Icronephrite stela of the Middle Kingdom of Egypt: "After the chest was buried, the death of the god was mourned for 3 days and nights. The festival culminated with the celebration of the resurrection. The pillar of Osiris, the ancient symbol of the harvesters, was erected in the temple court to the jubilant rejoicing of the assembled crowds, and the living image of the resurrected one brought out on a portable boat and displayed." See Osiris, death and afterlife of a god. And then according to Plutarch, Osiris was killed on the 17th of Athyr, and his dismembered body was discovered 2 days later on the 19th of Athyr, the third day, with rejoicing and the adorning of an idol. That's from On Isis and Osiris. Some scholars have questioned whether or not this is truly a reference to his resurrection here. All it says is that his body was discovered on the 19th of Athyr. But when you read Plutarch, it does mention the rejoicing and the adorning of an idol, which was used to symbolize the resurrection. We see this even in the 4th century in Firmicus Maternus. So this is most likely with his death on the 17th, the discovery and the rejoicing on the 19th, also descriptive of a third day celebration. So the aforementioned references provide ample evidence that the resurrection of Osiris was often celebrated on or after the third day. Torn to pieces but restored on the third day, let's return to Hosea 6. "Come, let us return to the Lord, for he has torn us to pieces, but he will heal us. He has injured us, but he will bind up our wounds. After 2 days, he will revive us. On the third day, he will restore us, that we may live in his presence. When you see the eerie similarities here, like Osiris, Israel is torn to pieces, but bound up and revived on the third day. Hosea may be utilizing both Osirian and Canaanite imagery to poetically convey the metaphorical death and resurrection of Israel. This is not far-fetched. Ancient Canaan and the Baal cycle is a given, but as we've seen, ancient Egypt maintained a presence in Israel as well, and this piece here smacks so much of the Osiris myth that it's a very worthy speculation. The restored Osiris is the restored Egypt. Egyptologist Jan Osman describes ancient texts in which the body of Osiris, restored and brought back to life, represents the entirety of the land of Egypt. As he says, the embalming ritual is applied to the entire land of Egypt in order to heal its disunity, to unite it, to endow it with life, and to renew it. The festival period begins with the finding and embalming of the 42 scattered limbs of the slain Osiris, which are brought from the 42 nomes of the land and ritually joined together and brought to life. That's from Death and Salvation in ancient Egypt. So, of course, we know that the dismemberment and the restoration and resurrection of Osiris had potent significance for the individual who hoped to attain life everlasting, but it was also used as a metaphor for the entire land of Egypt. Now look at Ezekiel 37 in the valley of dry bones. Prophesy to these bones and say to them, dry bones, hear the word of the Lord. This is what the sovereign Lord says to these bones. I will make breath enter you, and you will come to life. I will attach tendons to you and make flesh come upon you and cover you with skin. I will put breath in you, and you will come to life. Then you will know that I am the Lord. So I prophesied as I was commanded. And as I was prophesying, there was a noise, a rattling sound, and the bones came together, bone to bone. I looked, and tendons and flesh appeared on them, and skin covered them. Then he said to me, Son of man, these bones are the people of Israel. So we see in Ezekiel 37 this motif of the bones and the flesh rejoining as being a symbol, a metaphor for the entire land of Israel. A shared metaphor for national renewal. This is eerily reminiscent of ancient Egyptian texts in which the deceased, like Osiris, have their flesh and bones reunited to inaugurate their resurrection. As it says in the coffin texts, Nut has come so that she may join your bones together, knit up your sinews, make your members firm. O Osiris, I have given thee thy flesh, I have put together for thee thy bones, I have assembled for thee thy members. Shake off for thyself the earth that adheres to thy flesh. That's from the Book of the Dead. Ezekiel appears to apply this motif to the slain inhabitants of Israel as a metaphor for the renewed life of Israel after exile to Babylon. Likewise, per Osman, the Egyptians utilized the imagery of Osiris's reunited flesh and bones to represent the renewed life of Egypt. So a very interesting parallel there between the way this motif is being used as a metaphor for the restoration of both Egypt and Israel. The ancient roots of resurrection. This is from Paul Ricoeur, a philosopher and biblical exegete. The Hebraic symbolism of the resurrection might have one of its sources in the ritual of Adonis or of Osiris, and also in the ancient Near Eastern mythologies of nature that have come down to us from Ugarit and the Canaanite religions. The tendency to eschatologize the belief in the new creation by removing it from its annual rhythm is said to be included in the ritual itself. Hosea 6:2, Micah 7:8, as well as Psalm 17:15, and even the sublime chapter about the suffering servant in Isaiah 53 preserve a trace of this cultic root, as does the reference to the Spirit in Ezekiel 37. If we admit that archaic rites get perpetuated in the historicized myths and in metaphorical expressions, this hypothesis is just as plausible as any other explanation in terms of sources or origins. So Ricoeur is not alone in this view. As I've said, it is shared by numerous scholars, past and present, including Lloyd Geering, Robert Martin Ackerd, W. von Badisen, H.G. May, and as we've seen, John Day and John Levinson. Ancient peoples adopted and adapted ideas to suit their own culturally specific needs. As M. David Little observes, ancient Judaism was a living Mediterranean religion engaged in active conversation and negotiation with larger religious currents of its time. In the final analysis, taking refuge in Judaism to avoid the possibility of pagan influences is fallacious, because Judaism itself was a syncretistic religion impacted by the dominant ideas of its own place and time. And really important to note, time and time again, you hear apologists say, well, these myths concerning dying and rising gods and other cults centered on nature and natural renewal and whatnot were cyclical, and everything we see in Judaism and Christianity is linear and it's a one-time event. What they don't seem to understand is, just as Ricker was saying, the tendency to eschatologize the belief in the new creation by removing it from its annual rhythm. In other words, you're taking an idea and you're refashioning it to suit your own culturally specific needs by turning it into a linear or quasi-historical or eschatological idea. And then getting into the resurrection of Christ, who was raised according to the scriptures. Finally, among the earliest Christians, as reflected in the New Testament, the idiom of resurrection comes full circle from archaic myths of pre-Israelite polytheism concerning the deaths and resurrections of those such as Baal and Osiris, to a poignant metaphor for the nation of Israel during turbulent times, to the ultimate victory and exaltation of the God-man Christ. Not because early Christians borrowed the idea directly from pagan gods and neighboring cultures, but because the mythic archetype flowed through the veins of Israelite culture from its inception, morphing and transposing itself in various expressions and permutations. Judaism and its sacred texts served as the conduit through which the earliest notions of resurrection were passed down. And really do note what Paul says in 1 Corinthians 15. He is saying that the resurrection, the death and his resurrection on the third day occurred in accordance with the scriptures. They're getting this from scripture, from the Hebrew Bible. By the time early Christians scoured the Hebrew scriptures for reconciliation and consolation in the 1st century CE, they surely had no thought whatsoever for Baal or Osiris. But the residual and lasting mark of those formative tales emerging from the mists of prehistoric nature reverence had already shaped and molded the deepest yearnings of their prophets. Christ raised from the dead is the final installment in a long and winding series of ideas stemming from the ancient proclamations, "Raise thyself up, and mightiest Baal is alive." And that is the end of the slideshow.
Wow, that was amazing. Seriously, there's so many things there. Looking back, I like that idea of like nature and like getting into this stuff like the nature cycles and imagining the gods in a metaphorical way like that. What it became is where what we do here at MythFish is to try and bring back where this stuff all comes from. Mm-hmm. And it can bring a renewed like enjoyment of the topic without getting into the literal ridiculous fundamentalism of what we see later, where this stuff becomes like, you absolutely need to believe this physical guy actually physically died and actually physically rose, and that one day you will too, and if you don't, you're going to hell physically, literally, like all of this ridiculousness that it became. And so while you were recording, of course, and talking, I unmuted myself and I was like, what's the definition again of synchronic? And I realized that's like in a single place in time. What's the definition of diachronic again? Because I remember reading this, and this is something M. David Little was mentioning, is that the meaning over time, it evolves, but also there's synchronic understanding, which means at a certain time in history, something has a certain meaning at that time. And so I'm going to get to the super chats, and then if people don't cover some of the questions I had in mind along the way, I will ask them throughout, but I want to address the people who are helping me do what I do here at Myth Vision, and everybody who's super chatted, showing love, things like that. People in the chat who hit the like button, who can't afford a super chat, people who are commenting, people who are sharing this information, and just people who are enjoying in the chat, rooting Derek on along with this presentation. Thank you, everybody. Everybody plays a significant role. Derek, you blew my mind. I'm not even kidding you. Like, I've heard you say some of this stuff before, but you weren't lying when you called me the other day and you're like, you're going to like what I put together here. And I really love it, man. So I want everybody to subscribe to you. I pinned the comment with his YouTube channel. Go subscribe, join his Patreon, help support him.